Be here with you all in Lisbon today for what is a very special and wonderful event organized by the Foundation, and to moderate a very timely and important topic on the rights of women in the world today. We heard earlier about the experiences, the challenges, the struggles and the aspirations of women in Portugal. How similar are their experiences to the experiences of women and girls in other parts of the world, in India, in the United States, and elsewhere? What are the key differences that women here have when it comes to the way other women fare elsewhere? And what are the common challenges that all women face today, whether we live in the more industrialized, developed, and rich nations of the world, or whether we belong to more marginalized, perhaps poorer societies within the developing world? Well, we are privileged to have with us today two prominent advocates of girls' and women's rights. They come from two very different worlds, two very different professions, but they have each used their considerable success and international fame to speak up for the less fortunate, less visible women and girls in the world today. One is a professor at Harvard University. She's a former US ambassador to the United Nations. The other is an award-winning actress, an ambassador as well, of sorts, for Girl Rising, which is a global campaign for girls' education and empowerment. Please welcome onto the stage Samantha Power and Frieda Pinto. Frieda, welcome to you both. It's a real pleasure to be with you, an additional pleasure as well to be in the absolute majority, at least on stage, for a change. No male competition, so let's enjoy it. No offense to all of the wonderful men who've joined us for this discussion today. Before we begin, and before we hear from each one of you, let me just say something that we all here know. It's a basic fact, I think, that we have seen over the last couple of years, and that is that women's rights across the world has gained increasing prominence this year and last year, not just with the Me Too hashtag movements we've seen, but also with the marches that we've seen across many different cities in the US, but across the world as well, the political statements of solidarity that we've heard as well. So it seems that the push for gender equality, gender parity, has gained unprecedented momentum in many different parts of the world. But how do we turn this momentum now into concrete action? I've covered the UN for many years, and I think one of the main things there was that we talk a lot about women's issues, but how do we actually turn the conversation, this global conversation, into something more meaningful? How do we make women's issues and women's rights part of the global agenda? A timely and critical discussion to be had, I believe, and not least because, as we all know, women make up almost half of the world's population, something that we don't hear so much or talk so much about, and the statistics are debatable. But whatever the numbers are, whether it is 70% of the world's population, let me take it back, whether women make up 70% of the world's poor, or 2/3 of those who are without an education, who are not given the opportunity to learn to write and read, whether it is girls, is perhaps up for debate in terms of statistics, but what is certainly clear, and I think not debatable, and the research has shown, is that women in general and girls fare far worse off than boys and men do on many different fronts. Too many women around the world today in the developing world are not allowed to finish their education, to go to school, to learn. Too many women around the world are not given the opportunity to control their own lives, to control financial assets, land, to attain the highest political office in their own countries. So a lot of obstacles still facing women, although I hate to start on such a negative note, even though as a skeptical journalist I tend to. There have been huge strides that have been made, but it seems to me, and we will hear from both our speakers, whether there has been enough and what more can be done. Women in too many places are still far too underrated, underrepresented, and undervalued. Samantha Power, let me turn to you. We are going to be hearing from you first. You held one of the most powerful and visible roles in the US government for about 8 years, under the Obama administration, a cabinet-level position as US ambassador to the United Nations. You wielded both power and influence in a very male-dominated environment, the Security Council. But where did women's issues fit? Where did they feature in an agenda that was already packed with, people might say, far too and far more urgent issues relating to security and peace? Where do they fit in today's global agenda as well, in a world that is often too consumed by threats to national security? Top issues that I don't want you to answer just yet, Samantha Power, but I want us to perhaps think about as we carry on this conversation. But first off, let me please invite you to the stage for your opening remarks. Samantha Power.
Thank you. I could not be more delighted to be here, and Gita, thank you for joining us, for moderating, for your leadership and trailblazing as a remarkable woman journalist who's done so much around the world. I'm honored to be with Frieda, who I've just met, and who I've watched on the big screen for a long time, so it's a thrill to be here. And above all, I just want to thank the remarkable Manuel dos Santos Foundation for everything that they have invested in over this last decade. And this is an extremely worthy celebration of their 10 years of work here in Portugal. And I feel it's no coincidence that on their 10-year anniversary, they're talking about the most important issue of all, which is the empowerment and need for the equality of women. So I am, again, very, very happy. I wanted to fly to Portugal to be a part of this because I do believe that women are needed in leadership and in public service now more than ever. And I have come to believe that there are many things that each of us can do, men and women alike, to make that more likely, to make it happen more often. So in my very brief time, I'm going to speak to you up here before we get into the discussion, I want to focus on 3 steps that I think each of us can take. First, recognizing the importance of symbols. Second, and this is maybe a little counterintuitive, getting better, especially the women among us, at oversharing, sharing too much. Do you know the American acronym TMI? Too much information. I'm encouraging more TMI. And then third, especially again for women, looking out for other women. So by way of background, as you heard, I was a journalist and a human rights activist. I was someone who never dreamed that I would find myself at the highest levels of the US government. But I have to confess that having been a journalist, an activist, and an academic before, I was actually not that self-conscious as a professional woman. It took going to the White House and the United Nations, one of the most male-dominated institutions on earth, to really become self-conscious and self-aware as a female professional. Now, in his 8 years in office, I would like to take note, President Obama appointed the highest number of women to cabinet-level positions in US history. That is not a record that is going to be broken by this administration, that's for sure. But in 2009, which is when I arrived at the White House to serve as the President's Human Rights Advisor, men held 2/3 of the jobs. So that's even in the Obama administration. The most vivid occasion in which the gender dynamics at the White House burst into public scrutiny or display came in December 2012. And I'm trying here to, so December 2012, during economic negotiations, when the White House released this photo of President Obama seated in the Oval Office with his back to the camera, giving direction to his political, economic, and communications teams. Now, this was a group that on its face looked, like many of the rooms you find yourselves in, very male. Critics pounced on this photograph for this very enlightened president to have assembled a meeting of this nature at a time of crisis. And when the critics pounced, the White House made a blunder, which is they actually thought that it was a good idea to respond to the criticism by pointing out that people actually just needed to look more carefully at the photograph. Does anybody remember this? Can anybody see what we're missing when we look at the photograph? If you look just behind the guy with the light blue shirt and the brown corduroys, you will see a knee. You will see not just any knee. And you're wondering, the Portuguese translation of knee, right, is you weren't expecting that. You will see the black tights, the leg, let me say the leg, of Valerie Jarrett.
Who was that?
So someone at the White House thought it was a good idea to say, no, no, no. There's Valerie Jarrett's knee. What are you complaining about? So Jodi Kantor, who actually would go on to be much heralded for her work on Harvey Weinstein and the Me Too movement at the time, and this was again back in 2012, tweeted Jarrett's leg as metaphor. So this maybe, if you do a conference like this again, this could be, you know, part of the brochure. So President Obama, in hearing the criticism and being, again, the son of a trailblazing mother, the father of two remarkable daughters, and of course, the spouse of one of the great dynamos of our time, called the women advisors of his to the White House to talk about what more he could do. And in the years going forward, he changed those ratios of hiring and created full parity in terms of the hiring at the White House itself. But he also made a very special effort to call on and to affirm the work of his women advisors in meetings. So my first point today is that what we see matters tremendously. Take this photograph. I almost don't even need to say more.
Frieda.
5-year-old Jacob Philadelphia in 2009, tentatively reaching up to feel President Obama's hair, to just make sure, really sure, that an African American just like Jacob was actually president of the United States, somebody with hair just like his. So Jacob seeing President Obama, and then the world seeing this photograph. Think of how much we learned just from seeing this. In his second term, as I mentioned, the gender dynamics changed at the White House, and the White House wisely decided to release in 2015 this photo of the president conferring with his advisors. When I look back at my own kind of jagged journey to joining you here today, I look back to this moment. I wasn't actually present at this moment. I was a kid, and I was a new immigrant to the United States from the country of Ireland, near here. And my parents subscribed to the New York Times, and I opened up the New York Times and I saw this image of Ronald Reagan's cabinet, and there was Jean Kirkpatrick, the first ever American woman UN ambassador, and the first ever woman to serve in the National Security Cabinet of the President of the United States. So I can't tell you that there's a straight line from my seeing that photo and I said, aha, okay, I too am going to go forth. No, it was nothing like that. But what you see matters. And the fact that I can remember exactly where I was standing in our kitchen in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania when I saw that photo, I think is a reminder again of how our norms and our expectations get shaped by what we see. Since World War II, when the UN was created, unfortunately, as I think people in Portugal know uniquely well, there has never been a woman Secretary General. So there we go. 74 years, despite the great deference to human rights and fundamental freedoms in the UN Charter. This is the roster. Many of you will recognize Antonio Guterres here. Hopes were very high among many at the UN, not his hopes, but hopes were high among many that 2016 would be the year when a female Secretary General would be chosen for the first time. Guterres, I was very much a part of this selection process with the other countries on the Security Council. Guterres proved so experienced and so capable a leader that he was selected. But the pool of candidates was dramatically different than we had ever seen before. Twice as many women ran in 2016 for the position that Guterres now holds as in the entire previous history of the United Nations. The same is true in our current presidential election in the United States. We now have more Democratic female candidates running in the Democratic primary process than in the history of presidential elections in the United States. But the reason I draw your attention to this is to point out something more subtle. During the campaign, when Guterres and these other candidates, including many really quite remarkable women, were going around and trying to sell themselves, a friend of mine, the Jordanian ambassador to the UN at the time, Dina Kawar, who you probably know, Dina took note of something that was happening in the conversations with many of her male colleagues. So many were saying, hey, you know, we would actually this year, this is before, again, Guterres had been selected, we'd really like to see a woman Secretary General, and everybody would sort of nod. And then the person would say, but just make sure that she's competent. And Dina, my friend, would say, what do they think? That, like, they're thinking to themselves, I was gonna do my nails, but I thought, nah, I'll just become Secretary General instead. As if someone's gonna kind of sneak through. And when is that question ever posed with regard to the other male candidates in the race? Nobody was gonna fall through the cracks to become Secretary General. Now, I will say, Secretary General Guterres has followed through on his promise to be the most feminist Secretary General in the history of the organization. And he has now created, for the first time in UN history, full parity among the UN senior staff in terms of gender balance. And I can't tell you, you can clap for him if you want. We are in Portugal after all. So this is the Security Council. We're not meeting at that time in the Security Council, but this is the 15 members of the Security Council. There's me, very happy. That was 2016. That is not normal. It is not normal. This was actually the day we chose Guterres. For me, back to my previous point about what you see, when I would be sitting sometimes in the Security Council chamber, you know, this historic chamber where the Cuban Missile Crisis photos were shown and issues of war and peace have been adjudicated through the generations, I would see, you know, up in the kind of gallery where some of you are sitting today, school groups being escorted into the Security Council chamber. And I would think to myself, oh, look what they're seeing. They're seeing this. What you see makes you think that somehow this is normal. And I thought about the young girls who were walking in on their tours, elementary school, middle school, junior school, you know, teenagers, but also even younger. Their sense of what is possible is shaped by what they see, but also the boys. In the 21st century, it goes without saying, and I think this is what this conference is about, it should never be seen as normal to have gender balance like that. Now to my point, my second point about TMI, about oversharing. I had to go through a grueling confirmation process, confirmation by the US Senate in order to become UN ambassador. This is a kind of rite of passage that you have to do in order to get into the position. I had written a lot in my academic career, not all of it beloved by the Republican members of the US Senate. And so at the end of this grilling by Marco Rubio and John McCain and many of the figures that you know from the Republican Party, the gavel sounded, my hearing was over, and this happened. Well, that's actually the Security Council again. There's the horseshoe table. This happened, which is that my then 4-year-old son jumped into my arms, I think just sensing that I had been under siege and wanting to kind of protect me, but also kind of hamming it up for the camera in a way I hadn't seen before. And a press scrum descended on the table with all the clicking lights and flashing everything. And I didn't think much about it other than, like many mothers here will identify, finally I will have a picture of me and my son because my damn husband is in every photo, because he never takes his phone out. I will never exist for my son when he's older. He'll think my husband, who does nothing, does everything. So anyway, that was my actual thought. But what happened was that this photo appeared in a number of very prominent newspapers, including the Washington Post. And I started to get notes and letters from women all across the country saying how heartened and inspired they were that I was going to be heading into a big national security cabinet job with 2 young children in tow. And kind of saying, hey, you know, if you can do it, I can do it. And again, I wasn't self-aware before that moment about what I was projecting. So from that point, this is when I began my oversharing. And while I was in the job, I talked about the inelegance and the difficulty I had, and I had help, but juggling these 2 children and the job that I was trying to perform for President Obama and for the country. So I talked, this is talk about oversharing, about nursing my young daughter while trying to manage with a secure phone in my ear the Syrian chemical weapons attack while nursing on the phone with the Secretary General and with the Secretary of State and even the President of the United States. Not a great visual, but worth reminding people again, that's what it looks like. That's the chaos and the craze often for many of us looks like that. My son, Declan, I had to explain my absences, so he now knows and knew then at age 5, 6, 7, 8 more about Vladimir Putin than any, and he would, when I was on the phone, most kids, you know, trying to get their mother's attention, we all have had the experience where our children kind of huff off in rage, but I bet your child hasn't huffed off saying, Putin, 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 Putin. When is it gonna be Declan, 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 Declan? So talking about one's doubts and anxieties, I think, is really important to remind people that they are not alone. And here I want to credit the foundation, whose report I know you just discussed in the panel prior to this one, and a report I read earlier today. And just take note of the fact that one of the things the report offers is the perspectives through data of other women on work, on housekeeping and housework and how it's allocated, on child rearing. And when you are a woman and you read that data, you feel joined. You see yourself in a cluster with other people, which I think is really important. And here these are just a couple of the very, I was about to say chilling, but jarring, maybe not jarring, maybe not even surprising to many of you here. You probably, the visual isn't so great, but this is the allocation. You don't even need to see the precise statistics. Maybe they were shown in the prior panel, but the gray is women, needless to say, and the white is men. And it's shopping, cleaning, organizing family life. And you can see how much work that working women, who are getting paid also to work, they come home and then this is what they return to, but they also return, I gather. What I loved about this particular slide in the report is it disaggregates childcare. It breaks it up into all the component parts. So I took a photo of this slide and I sent it to my husband. Because there's so much to childcare that needs to be disaggregated. It's shopping for the school books, it's organizing, I think there's one there that says organizing the life, planning the summer camps, doing the homework, preparing the lunch, doing the pickups, all of that actual work, and this is quantified in this report, I think, in a way. I think this is a gift, this report, to Portuguese men and women alike. So maybe a round of applause for the foundation on this report. Okay, my third and final point before we get to Frieda's amazing presentation is just simply an obvious one that I think is reflected actually hopefully by the three of us here, but that women need to have the backs of other women. At the National Security Council, I mentioned the gender dynamics sometimes were not ideal. There were 6 women senior directors, they were called. They're basically the top advisors to the president on the NSC, who were women, out of 26 total. And I, again, had the thought that only I was feeling like my points were not being taken as seriously as they should be, and I thought maybe that's because I do human rights. Human rights is very difficult to push in meetings. I thought maybe it's because I'm a former journalist. People think I'm spying on them or something. And then one day, a woman colleague of mine said, let's have a drink. Let's bring the women senior directors together and talk about how things are going. And this ushered in what we each put on our schedules, and we were each in very serious national security jobs in the height of the Arab Spring, but we made time every week for what we called the Wednesday group. So 24/7 jobs, on call all the time, but we were going to attend the Wednesday group. And each of these gatherings allowed us to talk about our kids, to talk about our failed romances, to talk about our struggles in what we were actually trying to achieve in the jobs that we were in. And we received a quality of attention that was often lacking in Washington generally, and even in the White House. It didn't mean we agreed with one another. Some of my fiercest arguments were with other women who worked at the White House, but we did not leave each other's points hanging in the air. And as we compared notes, I realized I needed to do more to slow down my hiring process in order to ensure that more women were in the pool of candidates that I was considering, and that I brought more women on board. So I learned a tremendous amount from these women. I also realized that I needed to use my perch when I got to the United Nations to try to look out for the rights of women around the world. And that produced this, and this is my last slide for you, this campaign, which I named #Frieda20. And this was an effort in advance of a Chinese summit chaired by President Xi at the United Nations, which was meant to celebrate 20 years of progress for women's empowerment and equality since the Beijing conference that you may remember from 1995. What we decided to do is every day for 20 days in advance of President Xi's summit, we would profile the life and the trials and tribulations of a great woman leader around the world, but someone who may not have been a household name beforehand. And each of these women had been locked up. So there are people up there from Ethiopia, from Uzbekistan, from China, where even protesting sexual harassment was getting people locked up, just as they were about to celebrate 20 years of progress. So I hung a very large jumbo portrait of each of these women each day in the window of the US mission to the United Nations, which is across the street from UN headquarters. This did not go over all that well with some of my colleagues, as you might imagine. But I am very pleased to say that combining this effort with that of the families and the friends, above all, of these women, we were able to secure the release of 16 of the 20 women who are depicted here. And what is so important about that is that imagine the ripple effects of every one of those women and the ways they change their families, their communities, and again, change the expectations of what people see around them. So let me close by simply saying it can feel very daunting these days to think about the amount of change that is needed to set some of those statistics right, and certainly to deal with all the ills in the world, some of which I'm sure we'll talk about in the discussion. But I think the reason I focused on 3 small steps that each of us can take is sometimes it's important to shrink the change. And all I can say in closing is that girls like this one, my daughter, and boys are counting on us figuring out how to do that. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Samantha Power, just what a heartwarming and uplifting way to end this presentation with that lovely picture of your daughter. And hopefully we will have, before it's too long, a woman Secretary General, perhaps even a woman US President. We'll get to that a little later. But let me just say that you've made so many interesting points. I've got a lot of burning questions that I won't ask just yet. But I think it's issues that so many of us women can relate to, including the frustration of appearing in too few pictures with the kids, the invisible moms. But more about that later. Thank you, Samantha Power. Frieda Pinto, you were born and raised in Mumbai, in India. You rose to international prominence, everyone knows, in a movie that I think we have all seen, Slumdog Millionaire. And you have since appeared in many movies, achieved critical success, won many awards. You've also been an outspoken defender of humanitarian causes, an advocate of women's empowerment, girls' education. You have seen firsthand the plight of girls and women in some of the most painful settings around the world. I'm sure you're going to share with us a little bit more from your vantage point about what it's been like to be involved, to help, and how it's changed you as well. Frieda Pinto.
So we haven't even gotten to the core of the discussion. I already feel like I've learned so much from you, Samantha. In fact, even though, Gita, you prefaced it as our worlds being very different, it seems like our experiences are very similar. So when I was asked to come here and speak to you and be part of this incredible endeavor, share my story with all of you, and talk about women today, I felt deeply honored that you found my story inspirational enough for me to be here. The idea, I suppose, is to rekindle that faith and the magic and the belief in what is often referred to when it comes to my life and Slumdog Millionaire and everything that followed as the ultimate fairy tale. And I have to agree with you. It was magic, all right. But not the kind with just stardust and red carpets, but truly the kind that had its rabbit holes and the distorting house of mirrors included. So 11 years ago, if wise old Yoda told me that my fairy tale beginning was about to see greater heights, I would probably see his point, but I don't think I would fully get what he meant. In the beginning, I felt that stereotyping stardust just covertly fall over the shoulders. I was walking down these often lonely but exclusive red carpets and getting snapped by the lens of that underwritten minority representation, amongst many, many, many other elements that came together to form my Hollywood fairy tale. You might be a little confused as to why I'm calling this a fairy tale, but don't be, because it most definitely was. So a fairy tale, by definition, is a story from another land, maybe a mystical land, which is all about victory at the end of it, with the help of some magical creatures and their unique spells. So was mine. So there I was, out of an multi-award-winning, Oscar-winning film, being courted by some of the biggest filmmakers, the biggest blockbusters, being offered every film a newcomer could only dream of. And there I was in this world where they didn't see me and they didn't understand me. There I was with this masked nervousness, this smile pasted on my face, a certain level of cluelessness, riding the wave because I just couldn't afford to lose its momentum. And there began this adventurous twist to the plotline of my fairy tale. This very loss of momentum is called all kinds of things in our worlds. In my world, they say, her star has waned, one-hit wonder, failed artist, and many other such things. What's worse than actually hearing these things is actually giving it life by believing it. And it hits you the worst because you just don't see it coming. In fact, I clearly remember that accepting it to myself was probably the hardest challenge. I wasn't in a place yet where I could dictate terms, nor did I know how to make those in power write parts that represented the complexities and the dynamism of the female narrative, especially the non-white female narrative. Now, don't get me wrong, and I'm not trying to be a pessimist. There were some people who truly believed in me, and they really tried. Those are the people I will call my magical creatures with their unique spells. They were men and women. And then there were some who praised themselves for trying, and by that what I really mean is they talked about how important it was to have diversity and representation in film and television, and then they conveniently fixed that issue by casting their picture-perfect token brown person in their huge blockbuster. So in 2014, amidst the state of anxiety that was partially caused by this erratic state of employment that I had, I felt like I was done. Not done with trying, but done with playing second fiddle to white men. Done with making excuses and listening to excuses. Done with being afraid of calling a spade, well, a spade. So after some careful internal deliberation, which by the way was also dubbed as total insanity, I decided to stand my ground and honor my talent. I decided to say no to the roles and the parts that undermined me, no to the experiences that troubled me, and no to the parts that further distanced me from myself. So basically what I'm trying to say, at that time in Hollywood, what I was about to do was say no to almost everything. So now I've come in kicking and screaming, and I thought my strife was going to end very soon when my agents and representatives and studio execs saw that I'm demanding to be taken seriously. And I thought that they would dig deeper and substantiate it with roles that were more meaningful. Rude shock. They didn't care. They continued making their money, and they continued writing their staid female parts. And what I started out as a protest turned into a massive nightmare. 2.5 years of being completely unemployed. So is this really a fairy tale, you may wonder? But believe me, it absolutely was. Because this is the point in the fairy tale. This was the moment where I met my knight in shining armor. No, not a boyfriend. See where those minds go. But it was a very true and dear friend, a friend that I'd kind of lost touch with. My vulnerability. Vulnerability, as I soon learned from my binge sessions on YouTube with Dr. Brené Brown. If you haven't watched her sessions, you have to watch them. She is amazing. Vulnerability is the birthplace and the gateway to innovation, creativity, and change. To create something is to make something that has never existed before, to embrace a certain uncertainty, and what could be more vulnerable than that? Because how else was I supposed to overthrow these careless and messy stereotypes if I hadn't even for a second experienced what it meant to be stereotyped, what it felt to be stereotyped? I had spent so much time and energy trying to outsmart my vulnerability, trying to run away from it, trying to mask it with this bravado and be heroic, that I totally didn't pay attention to the fact that courage is not always an outward and loud performance. In fact, many a times it's just your internal strength, and I already possessed it. It kind of felt very feminine. My problem was that I was just not owning it. So this took me this long to realize that courage and fearlessness was not the same thing. In fact, this unimaginable fear I felt of losing everything is what drove me to have courage in the first place and to be brave. In fact, my protest was pretty darn brave. So that's when I needed to shift gears and when I started looking for stories, different kinds of stories, researching more and reading more. Jim Quick says that if you want to be a great leader, read more. So I went back to the basics and did what I did best as a child, uninhibited, writing my own stories to change the narrative. Expanding my team with like-minded people, because it's very important to affect change, you have to have a great team. And quite frankly, it was equally important to extract all of the dead weights. I didn't want to fall prey to the victim game, and I didn't want to be a superhero or superhuman either. I lived each day with this gentle reminder that it's all about going through the motions, each and every one of them, making each day count. much like the good folks and my brave girls at Girl Rising, who did not make adversity their friend or their enemy, but they recognized it, they called it out, and they were determined to find their answers one day at a time. So in 2013, I began working with Girl Rising, and before I knew it, it became a constant in my life. Girl Rising started off essentially as a documentary film, and then it went on to become this global movement, this revolutionary movement that aims at creating behavioral change and transforming mindsets in the way girls are perceived, viewed, and valued through the brilliant medium of storytelling. 2 years later, we managed to launch Girl Rising India, and I helped produce that incredible chapter. I could greatly relate to that part of the stories of the girls where all they wanted was just to be heard. It lit up inspiration and drive within me every single day. Ironically, these 2 years was the same darkest part of my fairy tale years. Talk about everything happening for a reason, and talk about trusting that process. So why Girl Rising? Girls and women are conditioned to believe that we will always have a few, or even, maybe worse, just one chance at excelling and shining and doing what we do. In some cases, and in some parts of the world, no chance at all. They're conditioned to believe that they have a shelf life. They're conditioned to believe that when boys fail, they will have plenty of opportunities to rise up again. Why? Because they're boys. Girls, their fairy tales have to abruptly end. Why? Because they're girls. Girls in many parts of the world, and my country, India, are told time and again by old traditions and this vicious cycle of poverty that their stories are not important. Now, this infuriates me. And if it makes you angry, then don't try to conceal it, because your anger is justified. Because every time a girl is molested, raped, killed, burnt, witch hunted, or made to feel like dirt for 5 days of the month while she's on her period, there's this sinister drilling in of the message that girls are not important. The stories have no value in the cultural fabric of the human race. They have no part to play and no story to tell. So now this is the point where I'm supposed to share the secret formula on empowering girls. But there is no secret formula. You already know the formula. It's been tried and tested over and over again. It's been proven. It's been proven at this very institution. It is education. It is equal and quality education, a consistent education that will help these girls find their voice, that will help them become aware of their basic human rights, tell the stories they want to tell, and say no to the stories they do not wish to write or wish to tell. Basically, go out there and live their own fairy tale. And this is why we tell stories at Girl Rising. Because we believe that stories, they shape culture, and they have shaped culture for hundreds of years. They create visibility, and they expand your worldview. Eventually, they change mindsets. So what's our role in their fairy tales, you might wonder? Well, we have this incredible responsibility to unravel and piece together the missing links to their fairy tales, the missing links to their stories. It requires care and research. It requires awareness. It requires nurturing and a long-term commitment. It requires funding as well. But above all, I believe it requires excitement. Excitement to be their fairy godparents. Because we need to have families that are healthier, violence that is held accountable, poverty that is less rampant, climate change that is understood and tackled, and a reminder of how economically significant the contribution made by girls is to any country's GDP. And in the end, well, isn't this the fairy tale we all dream of? doesn't the happiness of our fairy tales depend on the happiness of the entire kingdom? Or, I don't know, is this too idealistic? Is our fairy tales just individualistic? What is the big picture? Thank you.
Fascinating, Frieda Pinto, to hear you speak so candidly about your own experiences, to use words that I didn't think I would associate together: vulnerability, empowerment, one leading to the other, knowing your value as a woman and standing firm, not, bending with the winds, not giving in to the kind of I'm being slightly distracted by the lights. Not giving in by all of the discrimination that we've seen, whether it's in your industry, which led to the Me Too movement, or further afield. I have so much that I want to talk to you about, but I felt that you touched on so many key issues. The importance of girls knowing their value, not just through education, but by also educating themselves about their own basic rights, empowering themselves, not just by going to school, which is already hugely important, as we saw in the study here in Portugal. Educational achievement, giving a sense of empowerment to women, of well-being, of what we can do in life. I want to first go to you, though, Samantha Power, because you, off the top, mentioned something that got my attention. You mentioned a few important issues for you, one of them, the importance of symbols. And it was hugely interesting to see you show some of the visuals. The woman in the Oval Office just relegated to the back with the knee in vision, you sitting among 14 other ambassadors, you being the only woman, constantly surrounded by men, and this wasn't 20 years ago, this was just a couple of years ago. So at the UN, you were Madame Ambassador, not Samantha, not Professor Power, and I say this because it may not be completely true nowadays anymore. I think there's a few more women ambassadors at the Security Council, but my point is this: you were sitting in that male-dominated, all-powerful chamber of the United Nations, surrounded by all these men. I wonder to what extent the symbolism in and of itself is important enough, because sure, there you were as a woman, but at the end of the day, weren't you simply representing a government, representing policy, the policies of the most powerful government in the world, I should mention, not a government known for its softest touches either. Did it make a difference for you to be a woman in that position?
Thank you for the question. Thank you, Frieda, for your very moving presentation, which I identify with in every possible way. My closest friend and I invented this concept, which was the Bat Cave. We didn't really invent it, Batman invented it, but we appropriated it, and the Bat Cave is our head, and the bats are all the insecurities and anxieties and vulnerabilities, and until you can identify them and sort of put them to one side or just ignore them, it's very hard to move forward. And so owning your vulnerability, I think, is a beautiful way to put it. So for me, I think the core of your question is right. I had it easy, I think, is in effect, I was, yes, an immigrant to the United States, representing the United States. That in of itself was a symbol. I was mentioning to the people who run the foundation that there's a tradition of immigrants to the United States serving in the role as U.S. ambassador, which I just love. Zalmay Khalilzad was an immigrant from Afghanistan who was UN ambassador. Madeleine Albright fled Hitler and the Nazis and then later communism. She represented the United States. So I was just the third immigrant in the job, and that's what people have until very recently associated, of course, with the U.S. brand. And we were also, the United States, the first permanent member of the Security Council to have a woman ambassador. And until last year, we were, in the history of the UN, the only permanent member of the Security Council. So to remind you that the permanent members are Russia, China, the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. You know, we've had many now women ambassadors representing the United States. The United Kingdom had their first appointed last year, who remains in the position, Karen Pierce, who's terrific. France has yet to have a woman ambassador, and nor does China, nor have China or Russia had women ambassadors. So I was America, though. We were the largest financial contributor to the UN. We were spearheading initiatives on ISIS and Ebola and the Paris Agreement on climate change. It was very hard for people to look through me in the way that they might otherwise have done. And that's why much of my commentary, actually, as you'll note about myself, was about being at the White House, where I couldn't say, I'm America. They're like, yeah, well, so are we. You know, everyone who worked there was in the same boat. But what I did at the UN, having had the experience of being at the White House and having that sensation, and needing this Wednesday group that I described for you, of this sisterhood that I never knew I needed before. It never dawned on me that it would offer so much support and so much help in the Batcave. But having done that at the White House, I created one of those in New York. And Madeleine Albright had told me when she was appointed back in 1993 as UN ambassador that she created something called the G7. The Girl 7. Because there were only 7 women ambassadors out of 183 countries. When I was there were 37. So that sort of, I think, is a decent indicator. It's a kind of good proxy for progress in the world, which is still only 25%, because we're 193 countries now. But I created the G37. And I had dinners at my house. We brought Gloria Steinem, you know, the great feminist icon, and each of the women from very small island countries to large countries where they were had made it through their very, very difficult systems much more onerous than the US system. They got to tell Gloria Steinem what she had meant to them when they watched her doing her thing in America. And it, you know, you could feel the ripple effects of what happened in the United States, just as we've seen with the Me Too movement. So creating that solidarity and knowing that just because I'm America doesn't mean, you know, that I'm not implicated in what's happening to these other women.
No, but let me ask the question differently, because I think it's great to have gone from the G7 to the G37. I think long ways to go still, but it's still hugely symbolic and important. But in these G37 meetings, for example, how much, being honest with yourselves, how much have you and your women ambassador colleagues really changed or affected policy when it comes to women? You were simply there, and by being there, that's a great symbol for other women, that they can actually do the same as you. But as women ambassadors, were you able to make a difference, to create policies that actually advanced women's issues?
Well, I'll start with Madeleine Albright, my hero. She, you know, again, the premise of your question is right, which is that each country is advancing its national interests, and those interests are often defined in capital, and the ambassador, in many cases, has no say. I was lucky in that I at least was in the cabinet and got to help shape the instructions I was getting. But Madeleine, in her day, this little network, it was only the G7 back then, but they rallied together to get the first ever female judges appointed to the International Criminal Tribunal. In our case, we rallied to ensure that there were more female police officers and female peacekeepers in peacekeeping missions where sexual abuse, not only in conflict, which we all know about, but sexual abuse by peacekeepers who are sent to protect children and women is actually being perpetrated. And I, from the standpoint of the Security Council, this wasn't taking advantage of the network, put in place, working with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the first ever, and it's so crazy that it took so long for this to happen, but the first ever requirement that if a unit has, as part of it, people who have been accused, peacekeeping unit, accused of sexually assaulting or violating women and girls in the country they've been sent to offer protection, that unit has to be removed. So this sounds like it should have been so easy and so obvious, but Egypt, Russia, China, and all the usual suspects opposed the mechanism that I was proposing, which was just an enshrinement of common sense. So did we change the world? No, but that's why I focus on shrink the change.
But was there much room for these softer issues, quote unquote, women's issues in an agenda
that is softer issues.
That is just packed with
It's a false
conflict.
dichotomy. They're not softer issues. Peace processes that involve women last, on average, 5.7 years longer than those that don't involve women at the table, which is one reason that while I'm pleased that the Trump administration is engaging in Afghanistan to try to find a way out of America's longest war, I'm not pleased that there are no women in the negotiations, because it's likely a predictor of how doomed the process is. And of course, you're negotiating with the Taliban, maybe it's doomed anyway for women. But I just reject the dichotomy between soft issues, hard issues, values, interests. It's not like that. When people's rights are violated, when there is not equality, as Frieda was saying in her presentation, the entire society is going to suffer. When girls are not educated, girls are going to have more babies. When people have more babies, there are more mouths to feed. When they have more mouths to feed, the GDP and the per capita income is not going to rise, and that's going to bring down the economy as a whole.
And as Hillary Clinton said all the way back then in 1995 at the Beijing conference, women's rights are human rights and should be as such once and for all. It caused such a stir. It seems so basic today to make it all one, because as you say, they're so closely intertwined that it's difficult to differentiate and distinguish between the two. And it potentially undermines, I think, the advancement of women to make it about women's rights as opposed to make it a whole. I would love to get your thoughts on that. But just moving on, just briefly to Frieda Pinto and some of the things you said, Frieda, and perhaps touching on something also that Samantha Power said earlier, that women need to have the backs of other women. It makes me think a little bit about the Indian context. I say the Indian context because you are from India, but it can be a regional context as well, in the developing world, in the more culturally conservative countries of the world. There is that notion, maybe to a large extent a misconception, that in some countries it is okay. It is okay to undermine women's rights in the name of culture. It's culturally sanctioned, if I can use this term. Try to set the record straight for us when it comes to Indian women and how much of a generational shift there is today. Whether the older generation is still holding back their own progress because they see a woman's place, being very culturally embedded, and whether the young generation is pushing open the boundaries a little bit more.
Well, I think I will start with, it is not okay in any culture, whether it's America, India, Afghanistan, Nigeria, it is not okay to undermine women. I think we need to start with that. It's and I think it is sad that we even have to question if it is okay, or if it is the fact that it is normalized, is that okay? I mean, in India, you bring this point up, and this is the kind of problem we've faced on ground with the community-led interventions with Girl Rising, but problems that have a solution at the end of the road, is that boys, let's start with boys. I kind of kept the boys out of my speech, but they're kind of very important. They're very, very important. They're the problem, but they're also the solution.
So very important to bring them on early on in terms of educating them?
Because what boys see in many parts of India, especially the rural parts of India, is that they see their mothers working day in and day out, household chores. So they believe that when they get married, their wives will do the exact same. Girls constantly see that boys are allowed to go to school, and they're not. They're held back, and the education is abruptly ended before the age of 14, 15, because they're going to be married off. So for the father who has to assemble this dowry money, it's already a burden to send the child to school and pay school fees. So they rather just cut their education short and get them married off. Now, meanwhile, all the children in the family are seeing this and learning this. I believe many a times when laws are affected, there is a huge government failure where they constantly focus on the tenure, the time that they're there, on certain problems or issues that might be at hand. But this is a cultural mindset that dates back to, I don't even know how many hundreds of years ago. So unless and until this cultural mindset changes, this vicious cycle continues.
And how do you change it primarily? Through education or through laws as well? Because as you say, there is also an environment of impunity when it comes to women, that some crimes can be perpetrated against women. I don't mean to just, bring up the case of rape, but rape and many cases of rape that happened in India over the years. We remember the incident in New Delhi back in 2013, I believe it was. A 23-year-old was raped and beaten to death, gang raped on a bus. The international spotlight on that story made it such that there were convictions at the end of the day, that something was done. But for most of the cases, they go underreported, don't they?
They do. In fact, there was Swati Maliwal of the Delhi Commission of Women basically said that she had to threaten the police commissioner for the reports because he wouldn't reveal it. And she said that there were 31,449 cases that were reported and 150 convictions. So, you know, there's first of all no transparency on what's really been happening. And I think the Delhi case was very significant for a country like India. So a lot of the times when I am working with Girl Rising, because I am not a policy advisor or some kind of political expert, it's very important for me to sit with people who have been in those meetings and learn from them, because ultimately the programs that we create cannot talk at the girls.
Right. And you mentioned earlier a problem.
Yeah, what's that again?
You mentioned an issue earlier, child marriage.
Yes.
How prevalent does it remain in India, and how do you actually address this issue without ruffling too many feathers? Or do you have to, in fact, in order to change things?
But you can't live in denial. You know, India was dubbed as the most unsafe country in the world and for women, and Delhi was called the rape capital of the world, and these are horrible terms, and you can't address them if you live in denial. So absolutely, yes, they have to be addressed. And how else are we supposed to create the programs if we do not know the issues at hand? So while you talk about the Delhi rape case, you know, there were changes that were affected. But those laws focused on the wrong things almost, in a way. They focused on looking at death penalty, for example. And really, death penalty has never proven to reduce sexual violence. And really the focus should have been, because this was a monumental movement, the whole world was looking at us. But there was a lot of public pressure, and the government had to respond to this global PR policy of the crisis in the country and respond hastily. And so instead of focusing on the social taboos that hold the country back, that hold women back, the focus was on looking at death penalty. And that was one of the many, many things that were looked at. And the Justice Verma Commission, I'm not sure if you know of it, there was a commission under Justice Verma that was specifically set up to assess the situation and present suggestions to the Parliament. By the way, the suggestions were completely rejected. One of the suggestions was about sexual education, and the second one was looking at marital rape. But the government said that marriage is a sacred institution and they do not want to touch it.
Right.
So yeah, there's all kinds of problems that we are facing, and so we need
Absolutely.
more women in the room.
And it's not an Indian problem.
It is not an Indian problem,
It's a
because
problem.
guess what? We're facing this in Hollywood as well. There's a Me Too movement going on over there for a reason.
There you go. A lot of issues that women face: sexual violence, sexual harassment, as you say, in so many different and unlikely settings. In the United States as well, Samantha Power. I mean, everyone, or people in general, have a tendency to associate the United States, you know, the world's superpower, the largest economy in the world, with an abundance of everything wonderful and positive.
I was wondering how you were going to finish that sentence.
I'm going to try and frame it nicely. I promise you I'll do my best.
Associated with...
But there's a sense, Samantha, would you agree, that, you know, people feel that the United States has a basic standard of living for everyone, human rights for everyone. But that is not, would you agree, the situation for a lot of women working under minimum wage, having to make do with health care, childcare, domestic violence, rape as well, happening on some US campuses. It's a mixed picture, would you agree?
Absolutely. And it depends. I mean, there's so many issues at the heart of your question, but I think I don't begin very many sentences with the following phrase: one good thing about Donald Trump. So but I am about to begin a sentence. One good thing about Donald Trump is that his election has incited such activation, and I don't mean just of voters, and we did see the largest turnout in America's midterm elections in November than we have seen in 40 years, but it has incited people who were living in the Batcave and feeling, well, you know, I'd love to change the fact that people on my college campus aren't reporting sexual assault. I'd love to change the fact that, you know, people in America don't have health insurance who need it, or if they have a pre-existing condition, they can't get health insurance, which was the case before Obamacare. I'd love to change these things, but who am I to run for office? Or how can I make myself vulnerable in that way? Because running for office, it's, you know, you're afraid of losing, you have to raise money. Even if you're running for your school board, there's a risk of just humiliation, right? Of putting yourself out there. And what do women and girls fear the most? Rejection. Maybe boys and men also, but all I can speak about is what I know about rejection. And that's what running for office and entering public life, or going to Hollywood for that matter, exposes you to. But what has Donald Trump made people think? They think, on the one hand, if I want to contest the cruelty and the violation of dignity and the attack on democracy being perpetrated by the person who happens to be our president, I need to be part of the change I seek. So that's one dimension. But the other dimension is, if he can be president, I can run for the school board. And so, you know, I take your question, which is about all the ills. The ills are there, but they're going to be there until people who are more interested in doing things from public office than being in public office are occupying those jobs. And the wave, it's not just about the number of women in office, which of course has broken all the records and everybody knows about. Look at the backgrounds of those women. They're not professional politicians. They're former business people. Yep. They were intelligence officers overseas. They are school teachers. They're the mother of somebody who was shot and killed, of a son who was shot and killed in gun violence. They know of what they speak, and that is what they are trying to bring to public life.
And there's already 4 women candidates who've said that they would run in next year's election.
Yes,
if you can believe that it's
more women candidates.
Almost inviting me to ask you, would you ever consider running?
I'm Irish, I'm from Ireland.
I'd
love to be in public service again, but
really?
I can't be president because we have strange laws that Arnold Schwarzenegger was trying to get changed for his own benefit, but he has not succeeded.
So for now it's a no, but it could change. No, Samantha Power, but just a quick follow-up, because you mentioned a number of interesting things. The anti-Trump movement, in a way. It's interesting to hear him the other day. I don't know how many of you watched the State of the Union, taking credit for all these women in
Raise your hand if you watched the State of the Union.
Okay, well.
Wow, that's really impressive.
It was late.
Donald Trump would say that 2 million of you watched the State of the Union. Just on the basis of that show of hands, it looked exactly like 2 million.
Fact-checking, exactly. But taking credit for all these women, and it's a record number of women, as you say, who've come to Congress, many of them because they're determined to be responsible citizens, activists, wanting to change the landscape. A couple of questions. The marches that we saw across the US, Samantha Power, to what extent, in your mind, were they an anti-Trump movement and women simply wanting to voice their political opinions about him? To what extent were they simply about women demanding their equal rights? Because I don't know how many people in the audience know this, but it is surprising to many of us to realize that in the United States today, women still make far less than men for equal pay. To the dollar, to every $1 that a man makes, a woman still makes about 79 cents, and it's actually much less for women of color. 61 cents, I believe, for black women, and about 52 for Hispanics. Having said that, I know that Obama tried to change things. Why isn't it working?
Because you don't turn water into wine overnight, because there is a tendency now, unfortunately, to want to oppose the person in the opposite political party, irrespective of whether you agree, irrespective of whether your predisposition was to agree with that individual. As you heard Mitch McConnell say when Obama was president, our number one priority is to ensure that he doesn't get reelected, even if we agree. And that tendency is cutting in both directions, so the possibility for implementing the changes you seek is greatly limited by polarization. But if I could come back, because again, it's very easy to lament, and I think polarization, like automation, are 2 phenomenon that it's worth having a whole conference on each of them if you haven't already, just in terms of what it's going to mean for the future of democracy and citizenship and so forth. But bracketing those questions, if I could just come back, because you mentioned the Women's March, and I just had a brainwave because Frieda mentioned the importance of bringing boys and men into the conversation. So I took my son, Declan, to the Women's March in January, right when Trump was about to be elected, and I was about to be ushered out of my apartment. We went to the one in New York, and there was the most magnificent, it's my favorite sign I've ever seen at a protest, maybe my favorite sign that I've ever seen made, period. And it was a middle-aged man, a little bit overweight, holding up a sign at the Women's March, and it said, "Not usually a sign guy, but geesh." So again, you're asking very good questions that if we had time, we could really get into. I mean, healthcare, automation and the future of work, the globalization and trade and how people are getting left behind. There's so much to deal with, but I keep coming back to this idea of how overwhelmed people feel by the very ills that you are putting your finger on, and how easy it is to get paralyzed and to want to just shrink into your seat and wait for the World Cup to come around and watch football because the problems just seem so big. But sign guy, teaches, okay, it's not much on a given day, but I'm not a sign guy, but I'm out here at this protest, and I've brought my children, and they are feeling the solidarity and the power in numbers. And by the way, there's a direct link, which we'll never be able to prove, of course, between these marches, which people ridiculed and said, they marched, they came, and what came of it? See the State of the Union and all those ladies in white? Mm-hmm. That's what came from those marches.
Right. Well, as you say, people feeling the injustices and things needing to change in this day and age, right? And wanting to play a role as well. It's not an antagonistic us versus them, women and men relationship. In many instances, the women, the men, the boys can be important partners. Frieda, to what extent do you find women in India and elsewhere, women who you meet on your journeys, are becoming increasingly strategic about attaining and gaining their rights? Maybe not. I mean, here we are sitting on this stage, a chessboard with the queen, the all-powerful piece in the game, able to go in any direction she wants, diametrically, horizontally, you name it. Are women being strategic enough in the way they are viewing their futures and how to get the rights that they need?
Absolutely they are.
How?
And that brings me to, that question is answered by what Samantha just said. There's power in numbers. There was this very isolating feeling for a very long time that if you came out with your story, if you came out telling the world by the way of maybe filing a police complaint or going to your boss and reporting a sexual offense at work, sexual harassment at work, that you would be witch hunted, completely called a liar, that your story wouldn't be believed. But now that there is a movement, and it kind of has, the Me Too movement has trickled into, it hasn't really gone into every section of society, but it has trickled into other parts of society as well, like the corporate, the farmers, and whatnot. And it has given people this power that I am not alone. And I think from the years that I couldn't protest was because I felt like if I said something, that would be the end of my career. I thought I was alone. So I think there is definitely power in numbers. What you see is very important. When you see the Women's March, when you see State of the Union, it makes you realize that the symbol makes you realize that you are not alone. It is definitely becoming, there's a Me Too movement in India as well at the moment.
Which I was just going to mention, because you talk about the power of numbers.
Yeah.
And I've read numbers, tell me how accurate they are. As many as 3 to 5 million women in the Indian city of Kerala forming a chain, a wall, a good kind of wall, another kind of wall, 620 kilometers long to assert their rights.
Yes.
How important is it? Is it going full steam, or is this train about to be stopped at some point because of whatever reason?
It does get derailed, but Kerala, it's a very important thing to also know that the society is mainly matriarchal. Yeah. And it's the state with the highest literacy rate in India. However, there have been huge problems in their film industry as well, down south, the Kerala film industry. And they are definitely coming together. What derails the movement and what derailed the India Me Too movement that was started actually by this actress named Tanushree Datta, was the fact that everything becomes sub judice after a while. There is these trials that are about to start, this police report, these investigations that basically question if the story is coming out 10 years later, where is the evidence? So how does a woman prove that she was touched by another man inappropriately, even though there are witnesses? How does she prove that she was touched? The only thing she can say is, I felt violated.
And that she wasn't to blame.
And that she wasn't to blame, that the clothes that she was wearing on set while she was shooting that little dance sequence were not the ones to be blamed. So yes, the movement does get derailed by you know, these, I don't know, calling women liars and whatever it is, just by that. But we do have a very strong focal group in India, actually, of actresses who have come together, who are actually trying to expand this movement into other communities as well. You know, as someone in the media, we do have the added advantage of having the media, and also the disadvantage of having the media, because then your story is immediately public. You know, then you can't hide. Once you've come out with your story, that kind of sadly also becomes, to a large extent, your story for the public.
And again, a couple of points you raised, but I promised to myself that I wouldn't hug the mic and that I would actually not monopolize the conversation. My eye's on the clock. But with a bit of luck, we get added a couple of extra minutes. Are there any questions in the audience? Because we would love to actually get your take as well as we ponder on all of these different issues, Frieda, that you raised, the importance of governments and other stakeholders. I know the Modi government in India has launched a national campaign called Save the Girls, but are they doing enough? That's a thought. But let's go to the audience and see if we've got a question.
Hello? Yes. Oh, goodness. Hi. I would like, first of all, to thank you so much for your participation. It's been truly inspiring. I would particularly like to thank Ms. Powers for her use of a word that maybe, I don't know if it was deliberate, but when you were showing these pictures of yourself in this setting with this all-male setting, and you kept saying, this is not normal. Well, I loved the use of the word normal, because if normal is that which is the norm, well, then it's exactly normal. But I loved how you said that this is not how things should be. And I actually correlated that with, you know, a bit of TMI. I work in book publishing, and one day, because, you know, I like pain or something, I actually took the trouble of counting up how many of the books that my group had published were authored by women in the past 3 years. And the publishing group I work for is maybe like 30% of the market. It's one of the biggest ones in Portugal. And it got depressing after a while, because the end results through fiction, nonfiction, everything from like romance to technical books, practically, the division was almost transversal, which was 80-20. We had 20% of women authors in one of the biggest publishing groups in Portugal. Mm-hmm. I know that men don't write more books than women, so what is going on here? And my difficulty was I wanted to
just very briefly, because we are running out of time.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I wanted to email my colleagues about this, and I didn't know what to say about it. I gave them the numbers and did some nice charts, but then I didn't know what to tell them about this. And well, now I do. I can just say, guys, this isn't normal.
So, yeah, what is normal anymore? Samantha Power, yeah, numbers, women in positions of influence and power.
Well, the question I was actually going to ask was...
okay, there is a question.
Well,
sorry. But
the question
very quickly.
Actually, how does one make evident that this is not normal? How do you make the case for diversity, essentially?
Yeah. Right. How do you change things? Yeah.
Well, I have many different mottos that I've come to in my old age, but one of them is it's really hard to change what you can't measure. And so what you did, I think, is illustrative of a first step, right? First you had to know. You probably thought it was bad or you wouldn't have measured, so you had an intuition. The foundation scholars who undertook the studies, the surveys that I included a couple slides and were hard to see, you should look at in the report itself. They had an instinct probably, but then they measured. And it's very concrete and it's irrefutable. Then the question is, what do you do with the data that you've gathered? So bringing it, of course, to the head of your publishing house, but I believe there should be non-governmental organizations, or depending on, the system in your country, in this country or in my country, venues where this kind of data gets tabulated and then publicized by the press. I mean, Frieda would be more interesting on this than me, but one of the things that I think Reese Witherspoon and others have done, they just measure not only how many women directors are there, not only how many major parts for women and minor parts for women, but screen time for women, which I found so fascinating. That's the most chilling of all. And again, I had an intuition, it's probably bad, but I would have thought 65, 35, and it's catastrophic.
And to add to the screen time, what is the content?
And the role, exactly.
And the screen time. You'd be amazed how many scripts in the early days, right after Slumdog, would come to me where I'd say something and the next line would be like, "Help me." And then I get helped, that's it, and that's my role. So it is very demeaning, and you're very right, that's the kind of work that we have to research, that we have to get into if you want to overthrow the way women are perceived.
Very interesting. In the last 4 minutes that we have, I want to get both of your final thoughts. I do also want to frame a couple of questions, if I can. To you first, Frieda Pinto, talking about how we can change this normal, quote unquote, more women in positions of power, not just in government, but across every field, not just women actresses, but women shakers and movers, perhaps, women CEOs of companies. There's apparently fewer than 25 in the Forbes top 500 companies in the world. How many more women in those positions do we need beyond the numbers, 50-50 parity at the United Nations, which you quite rightly mention is what's been achieved now? What do you think is a priority to move forward? And you, as someone who's a role model for so many girls in India and elsewhere, you have not just a voice, but a megaphone. How do you use it? And what do you think about the importance of symbolism? I grew up with, in the 1980s, with the notion that a woman in India was leading the country, that populous country of back then 600-700 million people, Indira Gandhi. How important is it to have someone like her? Does it make a difference? Is there the next Indira Gandhi out there? Your thoughts, your final thoughts.
I hope there is the next Indira Gandhi out there. Well, I can only speak to what I do, and I am very proud of the work that I do, and so that's going to be my playground, and it is storytelling. I think I'm kind of guilty, and I have been part of films where my characters, the roles that I played, were very demeaning, in a way, to women. And by that I mean it wasn't where I was overly sexualized or whatever, but there was one particular film in which I was supposed to play a primatologist, and I was told to research Jane Goodall. But when it came down to costume fittings, they stuck me in high heels and asked me to run down the Golden Gate Bridge. And when I protested and I said, "But why high heels? You asked me to research Jane Goodall. Have you seen any of her videos? And how am I supposed to work with animals if I'm in high heels?" And they said to me, "Well, it doesn't matter." And I took it. So I think what I can do as an actor, as an actress, a female actor out there, is I can be more responsible. It sometimes comes at a cost, and the cost is money and the value that we attach to it. It might come across as that I'm not interested in really putting myself out there in films, but that's okay. I produce my own material, and in the material that I produce, I want to be able to represent the stories that are untold, the stories that never get told for whatever reason. Lack of funding, no one wants to hear about a story of a burqa-clad brown woman. Well, guess what? They do want to hear it. You just haven't told it to them. And so I think that's what I can do in my world of storytelling, and what I can continue doing as an actor when I go out there and pick and choose my roles. And the last thing I can do is form the right team, because I can't do this alone. It's impossible. You know, there's a whole machinery out there that makes a movie, that goes out there and puts a film out there, then distributes the film. So it's very important that I find the right team members, and if I am producing a film, to make sure that it's at least 50% or more women.
Thank you very much. Putting your foot down and breaking stereotypes and just asking for the same things that men actors in your position would. I think a high five on this one, since it's the Sustainable Development Goal number 5, gender equality. So there you go. Samantha Power, in the final few moments that we have, but do take your time. It's 28 seconds, but I'm sure you can get an extra couple of minutes. Yeah, you've been asked to sort of, look into your little crystal ball and tell us how we move on from this situation. How do we, what needs to happen, do you think, as a former and very likely future political decision maker, Samantha Power, what would you do? What would you focus on? How do you feel? How optimistic are you about the way the women's movement in the US and elsewhere has progressed? And just on a final note, Antonio Guterres, we mentioned him earlier, everyone here knows him, Secretary General of the United Nations. I was fortunate to have a Facebook Live discussion with him exactly almost a year ago on the occasion of International Women's Day. He told me something that surprised me, but that sort of inspired me in a way, and that came out from the norm of sort of very diplomatic language at the United Nations. He said, power is not given, power is taken. I don't know if it was a call to arms. I wonder what you think women need to do.
Thank you. And again, thanks to everybody for being here and being part of this and caring about these issues. I guess you asked if I was optimistic. There's a wonderful late, great social scientist who invented the field of behavioral economics named Amos Tversky, an Israeli scholar. And he had a great line that I live by, which is pessimist. Why would I be a pessimist? If you're a pessimist, you just suffer twice. Mm-hmm. So, and that's not just the most pessimistic thing you could say, of course, but it's also, it's not mobilizing, it's not activating. So I act as if change is possible. I act as if we can find a way also within our democracies to contend with the new kind of populist authoritarian tendencies that are revealing themselves. I act as if we can, and I think that there's a lot of grounds for hope in this area, that we can imagine our societies living on the basis of the golden rule that each of our cultures, for all of our differences across geography and wealth, embrace. Do unto others as you'd have done unto yourself. So that's where I think my optimism comes from, is that, what do we teach our kids? If we could only have states that sought to enshrine the kinds of values that as parents we are trying to enshrine to young people, most of us, I hope, that if you could imagine governments operating on the basis of some of those principles, we'd be in decent shape. So that's one response. Second thing I would just like to note, which is a little bit heretical or maybe a little bit out of sync with where we've each been going in our discussion up here, but I note that some people have approached me in the Portuguese press since I've been here and said, okay, there are these women candidates running for president, Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris, I'm forgetting one, and Kristen Gillibrand, but aren't they just, does it matter? Aren't they just going to lose? Aren't women? And my answer is, I don't know if they're going to win, but if they are to win, just as if a woman is to become a CEO, or if a woman is to be the best actress possible, or director possible, or professor, it won't be, and it shouldn't be also just because they're a woman. It shouldn't, no. What are these candidates, how are they going to define what their vision actually is for leading the United States, for living by the golden rule, for pulling people up who feel like they're being left behind by international trade or by globalization? Why are they running? Because, of course, none of the women who've entered the race are running simply to become the first woman president any more than Barack Obama ran to become the first African-American president. And so I say that because I know we have young female students in the audience and young professionals, but one of alongside the solidarity and the sisterhood and the shrinking the change, know something about something. Have a core and a content to what it is that you want to make happen from a position of leadership. And that, of course, can and must encompass advancing the rights of women and girls, but to have more texture than that as well is essential, because sometimes we can get drunk a little bit on the sisterhood. And I think it's just really important to buckle down. And the truth is, until things change, you're going to have to be better and do better and work harder and do the housework too until things change. You're going to have to do it all. But you know, having that rigor is essential. And then my last and final word, because how could we end an event celebrating the foundation and all of its amazing work without quoting Eleanor Roosevelt? So Eleanor Roosevelt, my favorite Eleanor Roosevelt quote, "A woman is like a tea bag. You don't know how strong she is until you put her in hot water."
Yeah. That's a fantastic quote, a fantastic way to end. So to everyone out there, beware the power of women once it's unleashed. I need to thank you both so much for a fascinating discussion. We have learned so much from your insights, from your great experiences on this topic. So on behalf of all of the audience here, thank you both very much indeed. Frieda Pinto, Samantha Power. And if I may, on a personal note, and on behalf of all of us here on stage, and certainly on my behalf, let me thank the foundation, the Francisco Manuel dos Santos Foundation, for the extraordinary work they do for creating a database that I think helps us all become much more educated, enlightened about what we talk about, and obviously, as a result, empowered. So thank you all very much for making us part of this anniversary. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Frieda. Thank you so much.
Muito obrigada a todos pela vossa presença. Os 10 anos da